I remember that evening clearly, though I've tried to push it out of my mind countless times. The dining room was warm, almost inviting, with soft lights glimmering off the polished wooden table, but the air was heavy with expectations I could never meet. My family sat around me, their laughter easy, but sharp in its undercurrent, like the echo of a door closing I hadn't realized was locked. "You should focus on helping your siblings first," my mother said casually, as if she were sharing the weather. "Your dreams, well, theirs are more important." I felt it immediately, a pang, sharp and hollow, like a stone hitting the center of my chest. I forced a smile, nodded politely, and quietly sipped my water. There was no point in arguing. My father barely looked up from his plate, and my sister, sitting across from me, smirked like she had won some invisible battle I didn't even know I was fighting. I had always been gentle, eager to please, believing that love could fill the cracks of disappointment. I had believed that if I worked hard, if I stayed kind, my family would see me, would understand that my dreams mattered too. But that night, the truth settled over me like a winter fog. They didn't. My ambitions, my hopes, my future, they were invisible. Not worthless. Invisible. I kept smiling. I nodded again. "Of course," I whispered, though the words were only for myself. I didn't need to protest. I could feel their judgment, their impatience, even their quiet amusement at my supposed naivety. And for the first time, I realized that pleasing them would never be enough. Their love was conditional, and their expectations suffocating. After dinner, I walked through the empty streets alone, letting the chill air brush against my face. The city lights flickered, reflecting in puddles left from the evening rain. I thought about all the times I had tried to bend myself into someone they could approve of, joining the clubs they suggested, taking classes they approved, attending events they considered important. Every choice I made had been to meet their standard, to earn a smile, a nod, or at least a lack of criticism. And yet, here I was, sitting quietly, smiling while they dismissed my life as if it were a shadow in a room already full of brighter lights. But that night, in the cold and quiet, a small spark of something unfamiliar flickered inside me. It wasn't anger, not yet, but clarity. If no one else would see me, I would have to see myself. If my family chose to overlook my worth, I would quietly create it on my own terms. I didn't need their approval, their acknowledgement, or even their understanding. I only needed my vision, my focus, and the quiet patience to see it through. The world outside was vast, and I realized it didn't belong to anyone but me. Their voices, their smirks, the casual dismissal, it would no longer define my path. I could nod, I could smile, I could walk away politely, but inside, I was already planting the seeds of a life they couldn't touch. A life built quietly, far from the expectations that had tried to cage me. That night, I promised myself that I would never allow someone else's definition of success, or their lack of belief in me, to dictate my worth. I would learn to move with patience, to observe without resentment, and to protect my dreams as carefully as I protected my own heart. The gentle young woman who wanted to be seen and approved was still there, but she was learning a new strength. Calm, silent, and wise beyond her years, she was preparing for the moment the world, or her family, would finally see the results of a life built quietly but fiercely. And though I smiled that night, it wasn't the fragile, seeking smile of before. It was a smile of quiet determination, the first step toward a future that would belong entirely to me. After that night, I began to change, not outwardly at first, but in small, almost imperceptible ways that slowly carved out my independence. I stopped waiting for their approval. I stopped explaining every idea, every choice, as if I owed them justification. Instead, I began listening to my own voice, trusting it more than the casual dismissals and faint smirks I had grown accustomed to. I found a small apartment downtown, away from the constant buzz of family expectations. It wasn't luxurious, but it was mine. I painted the walls soft cream, added shelves for my books, and set up a tiny desk by the window where sunlight would fall every morning. That desk became my sanctuary. Every evening, after my shifts at work and the small tasks that kept life afloat, I would sit there, notebook open, quietly building the blueprint of a future they could neither see nor influence. I started taking courses online, learning skills I had once shelved because they weren't practical or my family wouldn't approve. Slowly, I turned evenings into lessons, weekends into projects, and months into milestones. There were moments of doubt, of course. Old habits die slowly, and their voices sometimes whispered in my ear, "Why bother? You'll never measure up." But I had learned to treat those voices like wind, notice them, let them brush past, but never let them knock me off course. Meanwhile, my family continued on their familiar path. My sister flourished in the ways they admired, her choices loud, her success immediate, her life neatly in the spotlight of their approval. My parents, I noticed, reveled in her achievements, often pointing to her as proof of their guidance, their superiority. I watched quietly, feeling the old ache, but also realizing that envy or frustration would accomplish nothing. I would not compete, I would simply grow. It wasn't easy. Some evenings, when loneliness crept in, I would text a friend, or call someone far away who knew nothing of my family's subtle judgments, just to hear an unbiased voice. I allowed myself small joys, coffee from a tiny cafe, walks through the park at dusk, music that stirred emotions they had never cared to notice. These moments reminded me that a life built in quiet strength could also be filled with beauty, even if it went unseen by those I once longed to impress. Slowly, my independence began to shape my confidence. I started taking small risks, applying for better jobs, pitching ideas for projects, investing time in personal growth. And each success, no matter how minor, reminded me that my dreams were real, tangible, and worthy, not just fantasies to be brushed aside. I also learned the power of observation. I paid attention to my family without judgment. I noticed their dependence on each other in ways they never acknowledged. I saw the cracks beneath the laughter and the small moments of uncertainty they tried to hide. And I realized something profound: life often demands humility, and those who belittle others rarely anticipate the quiet strength that comes from self-reliance. By the end of the year, I wasn't just surviving, I was thriving. I had built a small network of support, a schedule that honored my goals, and a confidence that did not rely on their acknowledgement. I was learning the most important lesson: strength isn't loud. It isn't revenge. It grows silently, steadily, and invisibly until the moment comes when it can no longer be ignored. And in the quiet evenings, when the city hummed softly outside my window, I would smile, not the tentative, seeking smile of the girl they dismissed, but a calm, assured smile. A smile that said, "I am here. I matter. I will rise, quietly, and with dignity." That year of building my life, quietly and deliberately, became the foundation for the turning point that would eventually reach them, a point when their dependence and my independence would intersect, and everything they thought they controlled would be put to the test. It happened quietly, at first. I didn't hear the news directly from my family, I wasn't on their group chat, and they hadn't thought to call me. But whispers travel, especially when a crisis hits, and soon enough, I found out that my sister's business venture had failed, and my parents were suddenly struggling with unexpected financial strain. Part of me felt a flicker of old pain, the familiar ache of seeing them dependent on someone else, the way they had always overlooked me. But another part of me, the stronger, calmer part one had cultivated, stayed silent. I didn't rush to judgment. I didn't let anger dictate my actions. I observed, I listened, and I waited. I noticed the subtle changes when I finally saw them at the weekend family gathering. My mother's voice, usually confident and decisive, faltered slightly as she explained the situation to distant relatives. My father, who had often dismissed me as insignificant, was quieter, more hesitant, and my sister's once confident smirk was replaced with a tight, nervous line. Their world, the one built on their assumptions and their control, had shifted. And I was standing quietly on the edge of it, calm and unshaken. They came to me eventually, not boldly, but cautiously, as if approaching a fragile truth they weren't sure I would acknowledge. "We could use your advice," my mother said, her words heavy with unspoken humility. My sister looked down, fidgeting, her eyes avoiding mine. There was an awkward pause, a moment when the balance of power, previously invisible, seemed to tilt ever so slightly. I could have reacted in 100 ways. I could have scolded, lectured, or demanded apologies for years of dismissal. But I had learned that true strength doesn't need to shout. It doesn't need to humiliate. Instead, I listened. I asked questions, calmly, about their plans, their options, and their understanding of the situation. I offered guidance not as repayment, not as revenge, but as a quiet demonstration of the skills, patience, and wisdom I had built while they were too busy overlooking me. Their initial relief slowly turned into recognition. They began to see, piece by piece, that the girl they had underestimated, the one they had dismissed, who had smiled politely while they prioritized others, had become a woman capable, thoughtful, and emotionally strong. I didn't need to tell them outright. They could see it in the decisions I suggested, the composure I maintained, and the respect I insisted upon for myself and my boundaries. Through it all, I noticed something else. The shame of dependence is subtle but powerful. It was visible in the hesitation of my mother's words, the carefulness in my father's gestures, and the tension in my sister's posture. And yet, I didn't exploit it. I didn't gloat or demand recognition. I acted quietly, wisely, and intentionally, letting them feel the natural consequence of underestimating me for so long. By the end of the weekend, the tone had shifted. They weren't thanking me extravagantly, and they weren't bowing to my authority. But there was respect, subtle and earned. They listened when I spoke, considered my ideas, and began to recognize the quiet power of independence. And in that observation, I felt a profound satisfaction, not the rush of revenge, but the calm certainty that I had remained true to myself, nurtured my dreams, and upheld my dignity. That weekend taught me more about life, family, and strength than years of trying to please or explain ever had. I realized that emotional power is not loud or confrontational. It is patience, calmness, and consistent self-respect. The moment when those who underestimated you finally notice is not about victory, it's about quiet recognition, a natural consequence that arises from living authentically. And as I left their house that night, the city lights shimmering around me, I smiled softly to myself. I didn't need their approval, not fully. But I had earned their respect, the kind that comes naturally, quietly, and without drama. After that weekend, everything changed, not in loud, dramatic ways, but in small, steady shifts that reminded me how quiet strength often speaks louder than words. My family no longer dismissed me, not openly. They approached conversations with care, asking for my perspective, waiting for my insight. But the real change was within me. I no longer sought approval, nor did I flinch at dismissal. I had grown a boundary, firm but gentle, that protected my time, my dreams, and my peace. I remember sitting at my desk one evening, sunlight spilling across my notebooks, reflecting on how far I had come. The girl who once nodded and smiled, swallowing her hurt to keep the peace, had become a woman who could observe, decide, and act without fear of judgment. I realized that my family's crisis had been less about their need for me and more about the clarity it gave me. I saw patterns I had once ignored, subtle favoritism, quiet manipulation, and the tendency to place their own desires above mine. I also saw my own growth, the patience, the self-discipline, and the emotional intelligence that had guided me here. I didn't lecture them, I didn't flaunt my success, and I didn't seek apology. My actions spoke quietly but firmly. I had a life of my own, and I expected to be treated with respect. My sister approached me one evening, hesitant, and admitted the mistakes she had made, not as a plea for forgiveness, but as an acknowledgement of reality. My parents, too, began to listen differently, no longer dismissing my ideas as impractical. They still made mistakes, of course, but the tone of our interactions had changed. There was no dramatic reconciliation, just a slow, natural recalibration of respect. I found that this quiet influence was more powerful than any confrontation could have been. I could see the weight lift from their shoulders as they recognized, finally, that I had grown into someone they could no longer underestimate. They began to value my opinions, consult me on decisions, and consider my perspective, not out of fear, not out of obligation, but because I had earned it through patience, consistency, and self-respect. The most profound moment came unexpectedly. I was hosting a small family dinner at my apartment, not extravagant, just a modest gathering, and I noticed the subtle gestures of acknowledgement, my mother asking for my advice on a decision, my sister listening without interrupting, my father showing quiet pride rather than dismissive skepticism. No one said, "We were wrong," but their respect was palpable. And I understood then that true emotional justice is rarely loud. It is earned in silence, patience, and the unwavering dedication to one's own path. That night, as we sat quietly after dinner, I realized that I felt something I had never truly felt before: inner peace. I didn't need them to validate my dreams anymore. I didn't need their praise, their acknowledgement, or their favoritism. I had built my life on my own terms, nurtured my strengths quietly, and protected my boundaries fiercely. The lessons I had learned, the importance of self-respect, emotional intelligence, and patience, were now mine to carry forever. And in that quiet peace, I discovered the sweetest truth: freedom is not rebellion, it is dignity. Respect is not demanded, it is cultivated. Strength is not loud, it is calm, steady, and unshakable. My family had come to me in need, expecting compliance, but what they received instead was measured guidance, quiet wisdom, and the realization that I would never be controlled or underestimated again. I smiled that evening, letting the warmth of the city lights outside mingle with the soft glow of my living room. I was no longer the girl who nodded and smiled to mask her hurt. I was a woman who knew her worth, who had built her life on her own terms, and who could extend compassion, wisdom, and respect without sacrificing herself. And that, I understood deeply, was the kind of victory that lasts forever, not loud, not dramatic, but complete, quiet, and profoundly satisfying.